In 1879, settlers began to move west to what later was to become western Manitoba, until then inhabited mostly by Indian tribes. Most of the earliest pioneers came from Ontario, bringing much of that province's customs with them. Many started out from Winnipeg, in 1875 already an important service center. There were emigrants from the northern United States, from Europe and the old country. They came by ox cart, stagecoach, and stern wheeler, clutching their settlers' effects, looking for the new land described so glowingly in the advertisements back home. A Glimpse of Yesteryear is the story of these early pioneers and how they lived. The last ox train left Portage-la Prairie in 1880. Many young men worked their way west with the CPR construction crews. These young farmers of tomorrow were helping to build the link that would unite east and west, while at the same time earning ready cash for their own needs. What the new settler needed most was a home. A tent or dugout in the bank of a creek usually served as a shelter until a sod shack was made, sod being the material most readily at hand. Soon logs were hauled from the bush in Brandon Hills, Riding, or Turtle Mountains for more substantial houses. A family's history could often be traced by the improvements made to the family dwelling. The work of breaking the soil started as soon as a shelter was built. A single furrow walking plow pulled by oxen was used by the early homesteaders. The nature of the equipment changed as improvements were made, but the tasks remained the same. The early horse-drawn drills were a big time saver over the hand broadcasting method of seeding grain. After seeding came the harrowing and packing of the fields. Midsummer haying operations preserved the hay for winter feed. And the early harvest days saw the reaper cutting the grain, then the push binder came into use, and later pull-type binders were used. Stooking and stacking of the sheaves for protection from the weather was a back-breaking job, but the highlight of the season was thrashing time. There was usually a large steam outfit in each district that went from farm to farm. Some thrashing gangs had 25 to 30 men, and the farmer's wife and family were kept busy providing hot meals and lunches. The Carberry blower, invented in 1901 and built in Carberry, blew the straw into a stack at the machine, a real time and labor saver. Some of the famous Manitoba #1 hard spring wheat was processed and ground into flour at the local grist mill, like the one at Verdun. But most of the grain was packed in bags at the machine and drawn in wagons to elevators, then shipped by the new railways to points east. The first shipment of wheat from the west left Winnipeg by boat in 1876. In the early days, as today, a farmer's work was never done. Wells had to be dug and cribbed. A windlass was a great help in getting water out of the well. Horses had to have their feet trimmed and shod, and pigs had to be butchered for family use. Firewood was cut and drawn many miles for heating houses and fuel in cook stoves. Farmers put up ice in winter and packed it in sawdust for the hot summer days. You needed sharp tools for the job in those days, and you kept your equipment in shape yourself. Everyone worked hard, but homesteaders were always ready to help each other. There were plowing bees or barn-raising bees. These work bees were special community events where entire families gathered to help a neighbor. They helped the farmers get a big job done and became social events of some importance to the whole community. Many of the barns built in western Manitoba nearly a century ago still stand straight and strong today. Women played an essential role in the development of the West. While many shared the farm duties with their husbands, they were also responsible for the usual household chores, done with none of today's conveniences. But the hand washer was an improvement over the scrub board and tub for the family wash. And there were chickens to be fed and children to be scrubbed. One of the major concerns was the upkeep of the homes. As they tried to sweep out the sod shanty, the log cabin, and the first lumber houses, pioneer Manitoba women probably dreamed of what they would have someday. Many dreams did come true. New homes were built resembling those left down east or back home. Many were made of brick from the nearby brick plants. Mackenzies of Rapid City built with stone from their own farm, drawn in by oxen on a stone boat. The large frame house northwest of Brandon served as a dwelling for the Weir family and as a stopping house for Hamiota and Oak River people as they drove to Brandon. These homes had well-furnished rooms, the parlor with its pump organ, stereoscope, and gramophone, and a spacious dining room to celebrate grandmother's 80th birthday. The spare bedroom was well fitted with furnishings that antique dealers would envy today. And just as the farmsteads grew, so did the villages and cities. Tanner's Crossing, established in 1879, was one of the area's first villages. Today, it's the beautiful town of Minnedosa. Rapid City was a village of extraordinary development. The main line of the CPR was planned to pass that way. The first land titles office was located there, along with other facilities like the Royal Oak Hotel, the Prairie College, and a Baptist Academy, which later moved to Brandon and became Brandon University. But in 1881, the CPR went south, and Rapid City became a small rural service center. Virden was one community that became a boom town with the coming of the CPR. It had the only machine shop between Brandon and Regina, and that was important if you owned a car back in 1906. Boissevain sprang up on the present town site after the CPR branch line came through from Winnipeg in 1885. Early settlers had been seeking farmland in this area as early as 1878. Western Manitoba was soon dotted with growing villages. Alexander was the scene of the Great Grain Blockade in 1888, evidence of the growing wheat industry. Hayfield was typical of many service communities which were of vital importance before the invention of high-speed autos and the building of good roads. Most farmers supplied teams in their own hard work to build municipal roads. It was called statute labor. It helped the community, and it helped the farmer pay his taxes. Private homes were used for marriages, baptisms, and worship services. But as the small villages were developing, so were the schools and churches, both essential parts of pioneer society. Brandon Hills Church opened in 1896. It was made an exact replica of the one Reverend George Roddick left in Nova Scotia and stands today relatively unchanged. While Winisa's very first church was a community effort, the Strathclair Presbyterian Church was built in 1877, and Brandon's first Methodist church in 1889. The present St. Paul's Church in Boissevain was opened in 1890. Once completed, a church was the center of many important social activities, weddings and wedding parties, Sunday school picnics, midweek meetings, and choir practices. Schools were important to the early pioneers, and they built them as soon as they could. Chater School opened in 1885 with 45 pupils and one teacher. The first Sioux Valley School was made of logs, and Lyleton built its pioneer school in 1893. Brandon's first school was built on 10th Street in 1882. The hub of western Manitoba was the booming city of Brandon. It was designated a railway divisional point by the mere fact that it was 130 miles from Winnipeg. The city grew overnight after General Rosser made a decision to build in its present location, not at Grand Valley. Many speculators were disappointed, but Grand Valley was regularly flooded with the overflowing Assiniboine waters, while the new spot remained high and dry. The bare prairie soon became subdivided into lots. Stores, hotels, and residences seemed to spring up overnight. Ferries, private toll bridges, and finally the First Street Bridge were necessary if the river was to be crossed. Industry started, and the Hanbury lumber mill was one of the largest. Brick plants were kept busy once it was discovered that the clay in this area was suitable for making bricks. The Brandon Machine Works manufactured steam engines and fanning mills, and even cigars were made in Brandon. William Fleming, who lived in the 100 block on 13th Street, delivered water from his own well to Brandon homes before the public waterworks system was installed. He had some customers until the 1930s. Brandon tried to be prepared with its firefighting equipment, as there was always a constant danger of fire in the wooden structures. Life was hard and often full of tragedy. Hotel fires, like the one at the Empire Hotel, were the most feared. The asylum fire in 1910 was one of the worst, but fortunately, no one died in that Holocaust. Even the mighty CPR could not always overcome the fierce prairie blizzards. And prairie fires and cyclones in summer were always a serious threat. But in spite of hard work and disaster, it was a good life on the prairies. People gathered for fun and relaxation, picnics, powwows, and athletic events whenever the excuse offered itself. local boys were ever ready for the country hoedown, and the drama club provided fine entertainment for the city folk. Duck and prairie chicken shooting in the fall was a favorite sport. People did find ways to overcome the isolation of the pioneer days. Such activities were not always created just for the sake of enjoyment. The agricultural societies were designed both to entertain and to assist farmers. There were 50 of these societies in Manitoba by 1896, with each holding an annual fair like this one at Brandon. Farmers would drive for miles in wagons to attend a fair. The entire family would always enjoy the visiting circus and midway shows. The six-horse teams were a special attraction in the parades and show rings, just as they are today. The boom continued as hundreds of thousands of settlers flooded west in the period before World War I. It was an era of great optimism. Early in the century, Brandon could boast about its first electric power plant, 10 miles west of Brandon on the Little Saskatchewan River. A nearby farmer took advantage of this power to operate his thrashing machine, and this electric plant later provided power for Brandon's street railway system. The outbreak of war in 1914 ended the flow of settlers for a time, and people turned to another challenge, that of defending their society and their country. The first challenge of building the West had been met successfully. Other challenges now remained, but an important era of Western Manitoba history had ended, a period of history in this new land of ours never to be forgotten. A solid foundation on which today's generation can build for the future with confidence. The pioneers of yesteryear had a faith and a firm belief in the destiny of this country. As we take a glimpse of yesteryear, we look back with pride and gratitude on this heritage which they have entrusted to us.